The king sat on his throne, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest, his mind deep in thought. The grand hall of his palace echoed with silence, as though the very walls were holding their breath. The diplomat, a woman from the distant planet of Huron, had been escorted into the room moments before, her presence as calm and composed as ever. She was there to negotiate peace, to discuss trade, and to offer alliances that could further strengthen the already vast galactic empire under the king's rule. But the king didn't trust her. There was something about her that made him uneasy. He had seen too many diplomats come and go, promising cooperation, but never truly keeping their word. Behind every smooth smile, there was always a hidden agenda. He had no time for weakness, no room for deals that could weaken his position. This woman, with her calm eyes and poised speech, made him suspicious. He had received reports from his spies, warning that the planet Huron had been secretly building its military forces. He couldn't afford to ignore it. As the diplomat sat before him, speaking in polite tones about trade routes and possible peace agreements, the king barely listened. His mind was already racing with a plan to eliminate the threat before it could grow. He motioned for his most trusted general, who stood silently at the back of the room, and whispered a command to him. A quiet, almost imperceptible signal passed between them, and the general immediately left the room. The king smiled slightly as the diplomat continued her discussion. She had no idea what was coming. He had decided that this would be the end of the Huron threat. His plan was simple: have her assassinated. It would be easy. His guards were highly trained, and they would strike quickly, leaving no trace behind. No one would ever know the true reason behind her death. The king's advisors would blame it on a political rival, and everything would return to normal. What the king didn't know, however, was that the diplomat was not who she appeared to be. She wasn't just a woman from a distant planet. She was Baba Yaga, a name that was whispered in fear across the galaxy, a name that was feared by even the most powerful kings and emperors. The diplomat was no ordinary negotiator. She had lived for centuries, and she had faced dangers far beyond what any ordinary ruler could imagine. As the king's plan was set into motion, the diplomat sensed something was wrong. She had spent years hiding her true identity, playing the role of a simple diplomat to observe the political landscape of the galaxy. But she knew when someone was plotting against her. The cold, calculating look in the king's eyes, the subtle way he motioned for his general, it all pointed to one thing. He meant to kill her. Without a hint of fear, she stood up from her chair, her movements smooth and calculated. She had already prepared for this moment. The king had no idea what he was about to unleash. As the guards closed in, she reached into the folds of her cloak, her fingers brushing the ancient symbols hidden within it. In an instant, the room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with an unseen force. The king, still sitting on his throne, felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't explain it, but something was off. His instincts screamed at him that he had made a grave mistake. He had underestimated her, misjudged her completely. Before he could react, the first assassin stepped forward, a silent figure cloaked in black. His weapon, a sleek, high-tech blade designed for stealth, was raised, ready to strike. But as he lunged toward the diplomat, she didn't even flinch. The assassin's blade stopped midair, as if it had hit an invisible wall. He staggered back, his face twisted in confusion. The diplomat's eyes locked onto him, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The assassin's body froze, his muscles rigid, as if he had been caught in a trance. A low, almost imperceptible hum filled the room as a wave of energy radiated from the diplomat, pushing back against the guards who attempted to close in on her. She raised a hand, and in an instant, the air crackled with power. The king's eyes widened. This was not what he had expected. The diplomat was no ordinary woman. She wasn't a simple negotiator. She wasn't even human. She was something far more dangerous, someone who could not be killed by simple weapons or assassination plots. She was Baba Yaga, and she had just unleashed a force The king couldn't comprehend. The room seemed to warp around them as her power surged, a dark energy swirling in the air. The guards, who had once been confident in their abilities, now stood frozen, their weapons useless in the face of her power. The king's heart raced, his mind scrambling for an escape. But there was none. He had made a mistake, one that would cost him everything. The diplomat's voice, soft and chilling, echoed through the room. "You've made a dangerous enemy, Your Majesty," she said, her tone almost amused. "You thought you could kill me without consequence, but now you will learn what it means to face the wrath of Baba Yaga." The king tried to stand, his legs trembling with fear, but he couldn't. His body refused to obey him, as if some invisible force held him in place. He could feel the weight of his decision crashing down on him, his mind filled with regret. The assassin's attempts had failed, and now the diplomat was more than just a threat. She was a force of nature, a living legend that no one, not even the most powerful kings in the galaxy, could defeat. The diplomat stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with an ancient, terrifying wisdom. She had not been the victim in this situation. She was the one in control now. The king, in his arrogance and fear, had awakened something he could never undo. And the galaxy would soon learn that there were consequences for underestimating the power of Baba Yaga. The king could feel the walls closing in around him, the realization that his reign was coming to an end. His empire, his power, all of it was nothing in the face of the wrath he had unleashed. And as the diplomat's power grew stronger, he knew there was no escape. The final judgment had begun, and it was the king who would be the one to pay the price. The king's heart pounded in his chest as the diplomat's presence seemed to fill the room with an unnerving force. His once steady breath now felt shallow, constricted by the overwhelming sense of dread that surrounded him. He had thought he could control this situation, that a single assassin could rid him of this threat. But now, as Baba Yaga's power crackled in the air like an electric storm, the king realized just how wrong he had been. His body, frozen in place, refused to obey him. He could feel the diplomat's gaze on him, sharp and calculating. She wasn't looking at him with anger, but with something far worse, amusement. It was as if she found his fear, his helplessness, a source of amusement, like a predator savoring the hunt. The king's once mighty empire, built on power and dominance, now felt small and insignificant in the face of a being like her. "You underestimated me, Your Majesty," the diplomat's voice rang through the room, chilling him to his very core. "But now you will understand the price of such arrogance." With a flick of her wrist, the temperature in the room dropped. Ice seemed to form in the corners of the hall, creeping along the walls and the floor. The king could feel the air growing colder, the very temperature of his life shifting. He could sense the vastness of the power she held, ancient and beyond comprehension. She wasn't just a diplomat or a political figure. She was something older than the stars themselves, a force that could not be contained or controlled. As the king struggled against the invisible force holding him in place, his mind raced. There had to be a way out, a way to regain control, to turn this around. His advisors had always told him that no one could challenge his rule, that his throne was unshakable. But now it was as if the universe itself had conspired to bring him to this moment. He had thought himself untouchable, but now the truth was painfully clear. He was nothing more than a man, a fragile being in the face of a living legend. His thoughts were interrupted by the diplomat's movements. Slowly, she circled him, like a hunter stalking its prey. Her eyes never left his, and with each step, the king could feel his resolve crumble. He had made his choice. He had chosen to kill her. And now she had come for him in a way he could never have imagined. "You thought I was just a diplomat." Baba Yaga's voice was soft, but filled with deadly intent. "You thought you could silence me with your petty schemes, but you have awakened something far older than your petty ambitions. I am the wrath of the ages, the end of fools like you." With a sudden movement, she raised her hand, and the walls of the throne room seemed to pulse. The king's breathing quickened, his eyes darting around the room as he tried to understand what was happening. The guards, who had once been his loyal servants, now stood frozen in place, their weapons useless against the power of Baba Yaga. The diplomat's eyes narrowed as she focused on the king. "You are weak. Too much pride, too much ambition. You thought you could control everything, but you've learned nothing. The galaxy does not bend to your will, and neither do I." The king felt the air grow heavy, thick with the weight of her words. She was right. In his arrogance, he had believed that his power could overcome anything, that his empire was untouchable. But the galaxy, with all its secrets and mysteries, was far beyond his understanding. And now it was clear that the forces he had set into motion could not be undone. For a moment, the king tried to speak, to assert his power, to remind her of who he was. But the words died in his throat. His throat was dry, his tongue heavy with the realization that no matter what he said, he could never undo the damage he had done. He had challenged a force of nature, and now he would pay the price. With another flick of her wrist, Baba Yaga summoned a dark, swirling energy from the depths of the room. It was as if the very shadows themselves had come to life, swirling around her like a storm. The king felt his strength drain, his vision blurring as the darkness closed in around him. "You will regret this," he managed to rasp, his voice barely a whisper, filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. But Baba Yaga only smiled, the expression cold and detached, as if she had heard this kind of threat 1,000 times before. "Regret is for those who think they can change their fate," she said softly. "You are beyond regret, Your Majesty. You are already part of history, a small footnote in the tale of a greater force." The king's mind raced, scrambling for any kind of solution. But it was too late. His empire, his life, it was all slipping away. The power that Baba Yaga commanded was far beyond anything he had ever known. There was no escaping it, no fighting against it. As she continued to circle him, the king felt a strange weight lifting from his chest. He had spent so many years fighting, ruling, controlling every aspect of his life. But now, faced with this ancient force, he understood that all of it had been for nothing. The galaxy, with its endless political games and power struggles, had been nothing more than a distraction, a fleeting moment in the grand scheme of things. Baba Yaga's power surged once again, and the king could feel the heat rising in his body. The room around him began to fade, as if the very space itself was losing its solidity. He could feel himself being pulled into a dark void, a place where time and reality no longer made sense. His empire, his power, his life, they were all falling away, replaced by something far older and far more dangerous. As the last remnants of his consciousness faded, the king's final thought was one of disbelief. He had thought he could rule forever. He had thought he could control everything. But now, standing before the wrath of Baba Yaga, he understood the terrible truth. There were forces in the galaxy far more powerful than any king, and no amount of ambition could stop them. And just like that, the king was gone. The king's reign, once unchallenged and vast, was now crumbling like dust beneath the weight of his mistake. As Baba Yaga's power continued to pulse through the room, the very walls seemed to tremble with the force of it. The atmosphere was thick with dark energy, swirling in unpredictable patterns. The diplomat, no, Baba Yaga, stood at the center of it all, her presence growing ever more overwhelming. For a moment, the king was lost in a void of confusion, his mind racing with thoughts he could barely process. What had he done? The very foundation of his empire had been built on trust in his own invincibility. Yet now, with one single decision, he had awakened a wrath he could never control. The very idea of power seemed laughable as he realized how vulnerable he truly was. As Baba Yaga's eyes locked onto him, the king's body trembled. There was no escape from her gaze. It wasn't just physical. Her eyes seemed to pierce into the very depths of his soul, unraveling every secret he had buried over the years. Her presence was suffocating. The king tried to speak, to beg for mercy, but his voice failed him. The words caught in his throat, unable to form under the weight of her gaze. "You thought you could silence me." Baba Yaga's voice was cold, her words like an icy wind cutting through his thoughts. "But now you will witness what happens when mortals think they can challenge the forces of the universe." The king's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, not out of physical weakness, but from the crushing realization of his fate. His empire, once filled with vast armies and untold wealth, now felt utterly insignificant. He had spent his life building this empire, surrounding himself with sycophants who told him what he wanted to hear. But none of that mattered now. Baba Yaga's power, ancient and unstoppable, had rendered his strength irrelevant. The diplomat's features, once soft and calm, now twisted into a fierce expression. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, as the ancient magic that flowed within her surged. The room seemed to shift, as if reality itself was bending under her will. She had not only survived centuries of political turmoil and countless enemies, she had become a legend, an unstoppable force of nature. And now she was bringing the full force of her power down upon the king. "You think your guards, your armies, your allies will save you." Baba Yaga's voice was dripping with disdain. "You have no idea what I can do. No idea what I've done to the ones who crossed me in the past." The king's mind flickered to his past, to the many people he had crossed, the rivals and enemies he had crushed without a second thought. The faces of those who had fallen to his power flashed before his eyes, but now they seemed irrelevant. He had no one left. No allies. No escape. He had no one to turn to. Baba Yaga raised a hand, and the room grew darker. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist, coiling like serpents around the king's legs. He tried to fight back, to scream for help, but no sound escaped his lips. His body felt heavy, as though it were sinking into the floor. The darkness enveloped him, and he realized with a cold dread that he was no longer in control of his own fate. "You will pay for your arrogance," Baba Yaga continued, her voice now a low, chilling whisper that filled the entire room. "And your empire will crumble with you." As she spoke, the king's world seemed to collapse. The walls around him seemed to bend, the floor beneath his feet cracking open, revealing an abyss of darkness. The weight of the centuries-old curse she carried seemed to press down on him, suffocating him in its intensity. His empire, once the mightiest in the galaxy, was now a fragile memory. The shadows tightened their grip, and the king's strength waned. Every muscle in his body screamed for release, but there was no escaping Baba Yaga's wrath. He had made a fatal mistake, and now he would face the consequences of underestimating her. In the far corners of the palace, the guards, who had once been his loyal defenders, stood frozen in fear. They could do nothing. They were nothing in the face of Baba Yaga's power. The world outside continued as if nothing had changed. But within these walls, a storm raged that would tear apart everything the king had built. Baba Yaga's eyes glowed brighter, and with a sudden, sharp motion, the shadows released their hold on the king. He fell to the floor, gasping for breath, but he couldn't move. His body felt as though it had been drained of all energy. His mind was a swirling vortex of fear and disbelief. He had miscalculated. He had underestimated a force far beyond his understanding. "You will live," Baba Yaga said, her voice cutting through the king's thoughts like a knife. "But you will be a prisoner in your own kingdom, a broken ruler, surrounded by the ruins of your once mighty empire. You will never know peace again." With that, she turned away, her power still crackling in the air around her. The king watched helplessly as she walked toward the throne. It was no longer his. It would never be his again. It was now the seat of someone far more powerful, someone who had no need for the fleeting games of politics and power. She didn't care for empires or armies. She was a force of nature, and no throne, no crown, could ever contain her. The king could feel his own life draining away as he lay there, powerless. The very walls of his palace seemed to mock him now. The empire he had worked so hard to build was slipping through his fingers, and all he could do was watch. He had thought that nothing could touch him, that his will was law. But now, Baba Yaga had shattered that illusion with ease, and as she left the throne room, the king's last thought was a grim realization. He had been nothing more than a small, fragile man, trying to control forces far beyond his grasp. His reign was over. The galaxy would move on without him, and Baba Yaga's wrath would leave a scar in the history of the stars that no one would dare to forget. As Baba Yaga left the throne room, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The darkness that had filled the room slowly began to recede, leaving behind an eerie silence. The king lay there, on the cold floor, struggling to catch his breath, his limbs still heavy from the unseen forces that had drained him. His mind, once sharp and calculating, was clouded by a growing sense of hopelessness. His world, his empire, seemed so far away now, as if it was all just a distant memory. Outside the palace, the stars continued to shine in the vastness of space, indifferent to the events unfolding in the halls of the king's stronghold. But within those walls, nothing would ever be the same. The king's mistakes, his underestimation of the diplomat he had sought to eliminate, had unraveled everything. His empire, built on blood and conquest, was now crumbling in the face of a power far beyond his comprehension. The king's mind slowly began to clear, though the pain of his defeat lingered like a shadow over his thoughts. He had made a deadly error, a fatal misstep that had set in motion his fall from grace. His pride, his arrogance, had led him to believe he could control everything. But he had never anticipated the wrath of Baba Yaga. His body still refused to obey him. He could feel the weight of his failure pressing down on him, the realization that his once unstoppable reign had ended in disgrace. The king's empire, which had stretched across countless worlds, now seemed so fragile, as though it could collapse at any moment. Baba Yaga had shown him the ultimate truth. Power, real power, came not from wealth or armies, but from an ancient, untamable force that could never be controlled. For what felt like an eternity, the king remained motionless on the floor, his mind racing through the events that had led to this moment. He had not only underestimated Baba Yaga, he had misunderstood the very nature of the universe he had sought to dominate. The stars themselves were not his to command. He had thought himself a god, but in the face of this ancient force, he was nothing. As the hours passed, the king's thoughts turned to his people, his empire, and the future. What would happen now? What could he do to regain his throne? A dark part of him wanted to fight back, to summon his guards and his remaining allies, to attempt to reclaim his power. But deep down, he knew it was futile. Baba Yaga had already shown him how fragile his position truly was. There was no turning back. His actions had sealed his fate. But in the midst of his despair, a strange sense of clarity began to form. The king realized something else, something more terrifying than the loss of his empire. He was not alone in his suffering. His subjects, the millions of people who had looked up to him as their ruler, would also suffer in the wake of his downfall. His empire would not only fall from within, but the ripple effects would stretch far and wide across the galaxy. Baba Yaga's wrath would not end with him. It would echo across the stars. His mind flashed back to the day the diplomat had first arrived, the moment he had made the decision to eliminate her. If only he had known then what he now understood. If only he had seen the danger she represented. If only he had listened to the warnings of his advisors who had urged him to approach her with caution. But it was too late now. The damage was done. Suddenly, the door to the throne room creaked open. The king's eyes flickered toward the entrance, his body still weak, his muscles aching from the force of Baba Yaga's power. A figure stepped into the room, casting a long shadow across the floor. It was one of his trusted generals, a man who had once stood by his side through countless battles. But now his face was grim, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Your Majesty," the general said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and pity. "We've received word from the outer colonies. The people are rising. They're turning against us. The Empire. It's crumbling. The king's heart sank. He had known it was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud was a harsh reality. His people, the very ones who had supported him, were now turning away, disgusted by his failure. They could sense the shift in the galaxy, the change that had occurred with the arrival of Baba Yaga. His empire, built on fear and control, was now collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. The general stepped closer, his gaze never leaving the king. "There's nothing left, sire. We cannot fight this. The people are demanding change. They want freedom, and they no longer see you as their ruler." The king closed his eyes, as if trying to block out the words. His mind raced. He had always believed that his rule was absolute, that no one would dare challenge him. But now his very subjects were rejecting him. They were turning away from the empire he had spent his life building, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Your Majesty," the general continued, "the council has abandoned you. The fleet has dispersed. They no longer follow your commands. Baba Yaga's power has shattered everything." The king remained silent. His empire, his power, his life, everything was slipping through his fingers. The walls of his once great throne room felt like a tomb, a place where his reign would be buried and forgotten. Baba Yaga had not only defeated him, but she had also shattered his belief in the system he had fought so hard to create. She had reminded him that no matter how strong a king might be, no matter how vast his empire, there were forces in the universe that could never be contained. The king's reign was over. He had lost everything. But in the face of his complete downfall, a final thought crossed his mind. He had underestimated Baba Yaga, yes, but perhaps in the end, it wasn't just her power he had failed to understand. It was the ancient, unstoppable forces that had shaped the universe long before his empire was ever conceived. And now, they had claimed him as a casualty in their eternal dance. And as the general turned and left him alone in the silence of the fallen throne room, the king knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The galaxy was shifting, and he was powerless to stop it. The king lay there, in the remnants of his once mighty throne room, his thoughts spinning like a whirlpool of despair and regret. His empire, once a symbol of his absolute power, now seemed like a distant dream, fading with each passing moment. Baba Yaga's wrath had not only crushed his body and spirit, but it had also broken the very foundation of everything he had built. His arrogance, his belief in invincibility, had led to his complete undoing. Now there was nothing left but ruin. The once vibrant walls of the palace seemed to mourn his fall. The gold and marble that had once reflected the light of his glory now dulled, like the fading remnants of an empire in decline. His mind, still clouded by the remnants of Baba Yaga's power, tried to hold on to fleeting thoughts of redemption, but they were slipping away, faster than he could grasp them. Outside the palace, the stars in the vastness of space blinked indifferently. To them, the fall of a single king, no matter how powerful, was little more than a whisper in the grand symphony of the universe. The king had once believed himself to be the center of the galaxy, the ruler of all. Now he saw how small and insignificant his existence truly was. His people, his soldiers, his allies, they were all moving on. They were already looking to the future, to new leaders and new hopes. As much as the king wished to fight, to rise from the ashes of his defeat, he understood that his time had passed. In the distance, the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty halls of the palace. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. The general, who had once stood by his side, now entered with a somber expression. His face was grim, and his hands trembled slightly as he approached the fallen king. "Sire," the general began, his voice low and hesitant. "It's over. The rebels, they're everywhere. The people, they've already begun to rebuild. They want no part of us anymore." The king's eyes, once sharp and calculating, now felt heavy with the weight of his defeat. He had always relied on his soldiers, on the might of his fleet, to crush any opposition. But now he was powerless. His forces were scattered, broken, and his people had turned against him. There was no escape from this fall. "They've abandoned me," the king murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. His gaze wandered over the broken throne, the symbols of his reign that now felt like a mockery of his past life. "Everyone, even my own generals." The general hesitated, clearly struggling with his own sense of loyalty. "They don't see you as the man you once were. They see a king who has lost control, a king who failed to see the dangers at his door. We all misjudged her. No one could have known the true power she held." The king closed his eyes, the weight of those words settling deep into his bones. He had underestimated Baba Yaga in every possible way. She wasn't just a diplomat. She wasn't just an envoy from another world. She was an ancient, untamable force, one that had lived through the rise and fall of empires, and she had shown no mercy. A cold, bitter laugh escaped the king's lips. "I was foolish. My pride, my ambition blinded me. I thought I could control everything. I thought I could control her." The general's gaze softened, but there was little that could be said to comfort the king. His fate was sealed, and the galaxy had already moved on without him. Even now, his people were organizing, preparing for a new future, one that didn't include him. "The people are calling for peace," the general continued. "They want a leader who will heal, not divide. The palace, the empire, it all belongs to them now. They've turned the page." The king clenched his fists, but there was no strength left in them. The anger that once fueled him was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness. He had built an empire, but now it had collapsed under the weight of his own mistakes. The walls of the palace seemed to close in on him, each passing second a reminder of his failure. "Is there anything left?" the king whispered, more to himself than to the general. The general didn't answer immediately. He simply stood, watching the king, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "There is nothing left for you here, sire, but your legacy. It remains. Even in your fall, there is a lesson to be learned. The galaxy will remember you, not as a ruler, but as a warning. A cautionary tale for those who think power can be held forever." The king's mind drifted back to Baba Yaga. He had wanted to remove her, to silence her, but in doing so, he had awakened something far greater. She was the force of the universe, ancient, wise, and untouchable. And now, she would carry the memory of his fall with her as she moved on. No longer a diplomat, but a legend. The king knew, deep in his heart, that he would not be remembered as a conqueror, a ruler, or a man of power. His legacy would be one of arrogance and downfall. His empire, built on fear and domination, had crumbled beneath him. The galaxy would go on, and he would be nothing more than a fading shadow in its history. "I have nothing left," the king said quietly, his voice hoarse. "Nothing at all." The general nodded solemnly, but he knew there was no comfort left to offer. The king had lost it all, and there was nothing anyone could do to change that. And so, as the king lay defeated, alone in the ruins of his palace, the stars continued to shine above. The galaxy, indifferent to his fate, continued its endless dance through the vastness of space. But for the king, there was no longer any light. There was only darkness, and the eternal reminder of a fatal mistake.